I think most AI practitioners, what they really want to do, I really want to get paid, but what they really want to do is get stuff done. The more you can enable that and have them show real results that maybe also be able to be made public. If you're a large company, that you reward them through senior executive FaceTime in addition to the monetary incentives. So just getting things into production is such a high goal for most technical people, really treasure that more so than an extra tens of thousands of dollars of compensation. Of course, if it's totally disproportionate, it will still be attractive. But getting things done, getting things into production is absolutely a great thing and is very satisfying.
Welcome to Pioneers, the show where we explore the intersection between humanity and AI. I'm your host, Ankur Patel. Over the last 10 years, I've built 3 AI startups, written 2 books about the subject, and I run a weekly AI newsletter. I also regularly teach and speak about the topic at conferences. This technology has grown faster than I think any of us could have imagined, and it's making us ask really important questions, such as how ethical is AI? What will this technology look like in a few years, let alone a few months? And most importantly, does it have the power to truly change the world? And what does it mean for you? On this show, I'll be interviewing the founders, operators, and pioneers that are introducing AI into their companies and industries. We'll be asking them the really heavy-hitting questions that make them dig deep into the core of what we do. And without further ado, let's dive into today's episode. Welcome back to the show. I'm your host, Ankur Patel, and with me is Bjorn Austraat, who's an AI innovator and practitioner. He's also the founder and CEO of Kinetic Cognition. Bjorn, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
So Bjorn, I know you have a long history of working and serving enterprise, especially around AI. Could you share a little bit about your journey and what you're doing today?
Sure. So I've been using AI at enterprise scale for a long time, not always as a designated AI person or expert, but for example, I applied machine translation in the 90s in Los Angeles within a translation and localization agency. I then joined a speech startup that was in the business of contact center automation using speech recognition, which today would be considered AI. I was lucky enough to be in IBM and during the Watson team in 2015 and really seeing the Wild West days of Watson, and then later transitioned to the client side, was at Wells Fargo, running large AI systems there and AI projects. Then after that, at a bank called Truist, and now as of early 2024, I'm independent.
Amazing. That's a long storied history. And I think right now it's pretty exciting because I think enterprises generally are very open to learning about using, getting their hands on, particularly generative AI, right? That's been a huge need. And I think the major challenge now is how to get value from it. So could you talk about some of the present challenges the enterprise has around adopting AI?
Sure. So there's multiple nested challenges. And I think if enterprises are able to address them, they can really create a flywheel of value. And these factors truly reinforce each other. So thinking about generative AI in the enterprise, one of the core challenges is that it's a very attractive technology and it's very easy to go from zero to something very impressive. So to go to a proof of technology, a proof of concept very, very quickly, because the foundation models that we have today, Claude and GPT and now DeepSeek and so on, are all extremely capable. So making something appear to be working is very fast. But then, of course, there's a big stretch between that and actually producing enterprise scale value. And then a lot of the complexities start kicking in. So it's a little bit of shiny object syndrome. One of the core challenges that's net new, that's different from traditional predictive AI and machine learning, is that these systems, these large language models, are designed to be fluent. And so now you see one of our human biases kick in is that we mistake fluency for intelligence. And because the output of these large language models is all extremely compelling and convincing, and they're very, very confident seeming, right? Although sometimes very factually wrong. But because of the fluency, many people mistake that and imbue it with too much, trust and credibility. So it's even more difficult to distinguish between something that looks like it's working and something that's actually working. So then taking it from the POC stage to enterprise scale involves data integration. It involves governance. How do you deal with sensitive client data or sensitive internal documents? How do you ensure the privacy of that? How do you ensure it doesn't fall into the wrong hands, doesn't become part of the model training material, gets intercepted in transit? So those are all governance issues that need to be considered. Then the other thing is that because it is so attractive, you will often find highly motivated executives all pursuing their own project, their pet projects. And I jokingly liken it to Pee Wee soccer, where all the kids run after the ball and there's no organization or structure. And getting senior executives to agree what is more important in a non-emotional way is one of the key success factors of enterprise AI, for which you need a common language, a common framework. How do we agree on a 2x2 framework and sort things into things we should do right away, or things that we should delegate to partners, or things that we should hold off on? And then, of course, a solid platform is needed, a solid data infrastructure is needed. And those are all very challenging tasks. Anybody who's ever done enterprise data transformation at the enterprise scale knows that it's not trivial to get data assets really liquid and get them productive in the overall end-to-end process. And then last but certainly not least is the team. How do you think about your talent strategy in conjunction with all of these factors? And sometimes there are very interesting interplays. For example, if your platform is able to create good synthetic data, meaning data that's entirely made up but looks mathematically very similar to your core production data, then you can use that safe proxy to, for example, reach out to universities and have university students do projects with your own data. And that opens up new talent pipelines. You could also sponsor competitions on one of the many data science competitions and draw an even larger pool. So thinking about platform capabilities reinforced by governance, reinforced by a solid talent strategy, it all hangs together. And if you are able to push on all of these factors, you can create a real flywheel effect. That's difficult, and you shouldn't wait until you're perfect in any one of them or all of them, but incrementally build progress. And so overall, I think it's a lot about communication, which interestingly, my very first job many years ago in Vienna, I was an interpreter and translator, helped people understand each other. And today I still do a lot of the same things by translating between very technical data scientists, data engineers, machine learning experts, and senior executives, and help them understand and bridge that communication gap that often exists.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's tricky because if it's decentralized, in some ways you could move more quickly. You could get experiments under your belt, and we could learn fast, right? The velocity of learning is quite fast. But you lose the coordination advantage that you would get if senior leadership agreed on the strategy and then moved ahead. So I think the more centralized approach, where the leadership weighs in on the technology, picks and chooses which like platforms or foundation models or approaches to take, and helps people move in a more synchronized manner. There are huge advantages to that, but it does slow down the process. I mean, we've seen this where some organizations we speak to, it starts in a particular department, they have a use case or two, they're almost like raring to go, and then all of a sudden the leadership is now getting much more involved around the overall strategy, and so things really slow down, right? Maybe they get delayed by 6 to 12 months or more for the leadership to kind of agree on something. And so I think there's going to be a little bit of a trade-off between how decentralized or centralized is it, how quickly do you move versus how coordinated it is. But it's really interesting to see those trade-offs. I mean, I wholly agree with you that I think as a consumer, you're much more likely to adopt AI applications because they kind of get the job done. And even in kind of a partial, incomplete state, it could be very valuable. But the polish and finish in enterprise is the requirements are materially higher. So even though something might demo well in a proof of concept, to get it really refined into production, that's a major challenge that a lot of enterprises are facing.
Yeah, the liability situation is obviously very different. The sensitivity of the data that you're sharing is very different. And you brought up a good point, which is that getting an entire enterprise to agree on anything is usually very difficult. And federation has its place, right? So it doesn't all have to be totally centralized, because federation gets you closer to the end user, gives you a better signal from the end user community about the actual demand situation. But there's an unhealthy form of federation, which is fragmentation. So when you have suddenly 4, 5, 6 different platforms, you accrue huge tech debt, or you have 20 brand new vendors that are all like 1-year-old companies, and you accrue this big tech debt, maintenance debt, and exit risks, and so on and so forth. So thinking about your third-party risk strategy and your vendor strategy as part of your platform strategy is super important. And again, I come back to synthetic data, is if you wanted to experiment quickly with a lot of different vendors, onboarding them all onto your actual core production data can be extremely time consuming. I used to say that a free POC is a minimum of $200,000 of internal cost. Think about the legal approvals, the data movement approvals, the data owner approvals, third-party risk evaluations, and things like that. And if you have safe data assets, you can turn that on its head. And you can actually create almost like a competition of vendors and say, well, if you want to prove that you are best at, let's say, collections or default prediction, just log on to our developer portal, download our safe data set, and prove it to us. But it doesn't cost us anything other than you signing up to that portal. So again, as you can see, the platform strategy is incremental and instrumental to all other aspects of your AI strategy, because you have to have a long-run plan as you put the pieces in place where these pieces reinforce each other rather than just being dead weight loss because you're duplicating effort.
What about basically different teams trying to do generative AI on their own, right? I mean, I think there's a lot to benefit from, like learning, seeing how good the foundation models themselves are, and getting familiar with the technology. But at what point does an organization or team decide, let's go and build this in house because this is core to our business, we have expertise in it, versus how do we do like a search for the right vendor, whether it's a startup or a pre-existing player, but basically let's go and find an external software partner. How do you think about that trade-off and that choice that a lot of enterprises have to make on the various different workflows and processes that they have?
Sure. And it's an increasingly interesting question, as it seemingly is becoming easier and easier to use, let's say, Claude to write your own SaaS implementation. And so that's going to be a real big issue, and it already is for SaaS vendors that find themselves basically cloned or custom cloned by the creative use of these foundation models. To the question of what should we do, buy versus build, I like to think of that as a scale, or how close is it to your core business? It's extremely unlikely that anybody's going to make their own foundation model from scratch. That's the domain of very few companies in the world. It's possible, certainly, to create tuned custom versions of these models relatively easily nowadays. But from a packaging point of view, what solution should be used for back office automation, let's say, and things like that. Just look at how close is it to your core. Is it a credit model, which in banking is extremely close to your core, so you may want to really build your own there? Or is it something like document extraction, mortgage onboarding, and so on, where the actual processing of the documents itself is important to your business, but it's not your core competence. It's not what's differentiating you. It's not neither a competitive nor comparative advantage in the market. So that's where I would draw the line. Vendor evaluation itself is a science, and you do need somebody on your team that is skilled in the art of vendor discussions and interrogations, being able to ask second and third questions and deeper level questions. There's a lot of hand waving and flim flam today, and it's difficult to probe on vendor claims unless you actually know how the stuff actually works under the covers. It's tricky. The market is ridiculous. If you've seen the NASCAR charts of generative AI startups, it's probably thousands of companies. They're all very young, sometimes thinly funded. They pose a big exit risk if they go away or get absorbed. Some of them are simply a feature of a product, not a business. And so thinking about the ongoing long-term care and total cost of ownership is key. I think it's an important aspect of being agile as a large enterprise today, is how well can you engage vendors? How easily can you actually perform a POT or POC? And then how quickly can you make a decision? Because the volatility in the vendor landscape is so high. So keeping up with what's new foundationally, what's new with vendors is difficult. And architecturally, what I've seen more and more is that people think about that this is the model we're using today, or this is the image stable diffusion generator we're using today, but we've built in a clutch almost around our core systems. So swapping these things in and out is relatively straightforward. And thinking conceptually, if you needed to swap out ChatGPT for Claude or for DeepSeek or any of these models, what would have to change in my prompt architecture? Can I build that into my automatic prompt adaptation layer so that the user actually never understands or sees that the foundation model has changed, but I can safely now deal with that kind of swap? One thing to also mention before, that people go off and say, like, we'll just build our own. Let's say we'll build our own RAG system, our own retrieval augmented generation system. It is very, very easy to go from zero to something fairly usable quickly. Then the next tier of understanding comes into place. And one of the core drivers of the success of a RAG system is how you chunk the text that goes into it. And so now if every department has their own chunking strategy, their own embedding strategy, their own retrieval strategy, things can go badly very quickly, because the thing that works beautifully for the customer care team that wants to retrieve emails doesn't work at all for governance documents because of the way that these things are retrieved and make sense and need to be ranked. So then again, it's really important to go beyond the tempting the surface layer that makes anybody a power user very, very quickly. And it's, wow, I can build a whole app in Claude or Cursor in like 10 minutes. But then, having the metacognition, the meta understanding of how this actually works, where the difficulties will be, is absolutely critical. And that's where a lot of companies fall down, because they drive to something that's shiny in weeks, and then they all stall. And all of these POCs and POTs go to die because they are either not approvable by governance, or there's no model risk oversight, or legal risk and compliance has other issues and things like that.
Yeah. Yeah, I find that generative AI is ridiculously easy to play with. And I think that's what's encouraged a lot of engineering teams at large enterprises to try to build various versions of generative AI software on their own. So you're right, like RAG is a great example. RAG has run amok among teams trying to build different versions of RAG in different areas. And it kind of gets to an okay state like pretty quickly, but then people forget just how complex it is to manage and maintain long term. So I'll just kind of give you a couple of points, but I think you highlighted something that's super important, which is the chunking becomes really critical, and how you chunk in text versus charts versus tables, depending on how structured or unstructured documents is a huge challenge. And there are techniques to do better chunking, creating better embeddings keeps getting better and better. So some models are very good at certain types of formats and certain types of table extraction, and other models might be better elsewhere. That is an entire software business in itself, right? And so unless you're going to introduce that sort of capability or across the org, it's going to be very hard. People are just going to have like their own parochial views on how to do this, and they do it. But then also the approaches to doing RAG change, right? It used to be just using a vector database. Now graph has become a lot more common. And in a lot of the use cases in regulated spaces, you actually want to go a step further by fine-tuning potentially even some of the retrieval, right? And creating better guardrails and access to data, and all these things that you may not think about in the prototype phase, but become absolutely critical in production. And so you then end up with basically lots of engineers managing their own repos, serving different business units and owners. And there is nothing to go and manage that and maintain that in a more software driven approach in the long run. And that ends up being a huge total cost of ownership problem, because now you've basically assembled the army of engineers that then have to feed the software kind of side of the house. And that might be something that is better done through an external software vendor, right? Of which I know there are many dozens and hundreds that are trying to enter the market. So that's just like one example of many around the like generative AI and agentic AI use cases that are unfolding.
Yeah, and one key aspect of RAG systems is the quality assurance of what you get back. Again, it's going to all look very glossy and polished, but how do you know that you retrieve the stuff that's actually in the database? How do you know how to detect hallucinations, the groundedness of the answer, the completeness of the answer? And there are mathematical ways of doing that, and good stratified ways of testing that. I just attended a seminar actually yesterday, half a day, on just testing techniques for RAGs using cosine similarity and other mathematical techniques that are very, very powerful and actually can detect the quality, can truly judge the quality of the RAG result, including hallucination detection. That is a art and a science that many people are simply not aware that they don't know they need it. And hence they also not equipped to even, it's the unconscious incompetence. You don't know what you don't know. That means you won't be able to actually build that into your test plans and your deployment plans. And again, because RAG can seemingly work very quickly, it is a very tempting shortcut, and that can go horribly awry if your customer care representative gives an incomplete answer, and based on the retrieval system, they give an answer that's incomplete. That has already happened, of course, many, many times, either by bot or by agent. And then very large fines can happen. So those mistakes can get very expensive very quickly.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think there's this need to provide feedback as well. So if you're an end user of RAG, how do you convey that this response was good or not? That's one of the primary ways that the foundation model companies have improved their performance, is by providing this feedback through reinforcement learning and such, right? So that's a critical piece that enterprises, particularly in very sensitive areas, need to think about. And the other piece is the explainability. Where did that answer come from? Do I trust this answer? Should I do additional diligence, or should I run with this? And part of that could be mathematical approaches like cosine similarity. But there's just a lot more depth in terms of thinking around how to do that well. And you basically need to do that for every single RAG implementation. So if you think you're a large enterprise in a regulated space, maybe you have 100 different RAG applications you need to start holistically thinking about how do you go A, build it, B, maintain it, and C, evolve it, especially as the foundation models, the vector databases, the agent frameworks, the fine-tuning services, the chunking techniques, that these keep evolving very, very rapidly.
And then the one net new problem in generative AI is the foundation model drift. So that even within the same model family like GPT-4o, there are two instantiated versions from GPT. That's one of them is from 2024-0806, and one of them is 2024-1120. And these are both GPT-4o, but they behave quite differently. And then sometimes even that frozen version will start behaving very differently. And that's all composited with the problem that these are all ensemble models and they are non-deterministic. That means you can ask it the same question twice with the same temperature setting 0, even with the same exact model fingerprint, and you will get two different answers because you are actually not guaranteed to always encounter the same expert within that mixture of expert model. And then you get variability on top of variability. And being able to detect that in a systemic enterprise way, measure it, and throw alarms if it moves out of bounds is super critical and is absolutely essential to deploy this stuff safely.
Yeah, completely agree. So with that in mind, how do enterprises plan for like AI objectives, right? And I think the reason why I ask this is because it's great to be ambitious with your AI build, but at the same time, you need realistic implementation timelines, both for internal work you do and work you do with external partners and vendors. So what is your advice to enterprises that are trying to get this right? Hey there, very quickly. We just released a new agentic AI platform that makes it possible to automate very complex knowledge work. Our platform makes it far easier to set up multi-agent systems that allow you to coordinate work across AI agents, human supervisors, and third-party systems. This is the future of agentic AI, helping people get work done more quickly, adding more efficiency and productivity and better customer experiences. So if you're interested in agentic AI and what it could do for your organization, please book time with our team today.
Basically, thinking in 8-week increments is becoming increasingly important, not only because you need to increasingly show value and try to deploy things incrementally, but also because the market is simply changing so quickly. So if you're making a 1.5-year development plan for foundation models, some of that makes sense that you have a big strategy that actually rolls out, that looks that far out into the future. But you have to be able to react nimbly to market developments. Just look at what happened with DeepSeek, with net new capabilities in stable diffusion video generation, the big jump from Sonnet 3.5 to 3.7 recently. So being able to really react to putting in breakpoints and pivot points into your project plan is unbelievably important, all driven by the user experience. Like I mentioned, the big guiding question that I like to ask, whose life is going to get better by how much and how do you know that, is a very seemingly simple question, very hard to answer because it involves user experience, implementation, deployability, data assets, the potential kind of internal psychological red team aspects. Even though that system is good for the end user and it's aligned with our corporate strategy, that may make that person feel threatened in their job. So they may not want to use it or use it incorrectly and things like that. So thinking of all the holistic user experience and user storyboarding is incredibly important, all empowered by a platform technology that has now changed profoundly, at least 5 or 6 times since GPT's first launched in November of 22. So blending long-term and agile thinking is very hard because sometimes the market will force you to make a really crazy U-turn because suddenly the thing that you've been building has come out and is now simply a feature of another product. And it absolutely, despite all the sunk cost, makes no sense to pursue that strategy. But as we know, the sunk cost fallacy is one of the really tricky things in enterprise planning. as it's simply very difficult to abandon something that you already sunk a lot of money into.
That's right. That's one major challenge among many. And I think given how fast AI is moving, there's a lot of there. I'm sure there are a lot of initiatives that even sprung up in 23 that are still like, they're still alive and being worked on, even though it probably makes that more sense to sunset and kind of move on from that. And I think that's going to be some of the major, my major concern here for a lot of this is that enterprises are going to get disillusioned with some of the work that they're doing. Now, some enterprises will definitely get it right and they will see progress and that will encourage them to invest more. But others will kind of be on the opposite end of the distribution where there's some of the investments that they've made and efforts that they've made maybe sour, and it kind of discourages them and maybe disillusions them to some extent. So I think some of that's going to play out because I think it was so easy to get hyped up about AI, particularly as a consumer, seeing what it's capable of. But then when you get to the actual thick of it and applying it in enterprise, that's where it gets very real. And I think it requires a lot of enterprise endurance to be able to fight through that mucky environment that a lot of enterprises will find themselves in trying to get something out of a POC phase into production.
The idea of anti-fragility is really important. How do you inject robustness into the system so that you're robust against people leaving, that you don't have a huge amount of IP walk out the door if one of your lead developers suddenly decides to move on to, one of the big fangs or any of these large players, or another startup, right? Or start your own. And how you make models more resilient against being swapped out, in the sense of that the underlying infrastructure doesn't break because you have to go to a different foundation model. How do you make them robust against attack? That's an increasingly a very sizable problem for people, is that people try to manipulate bots, visual recognition systems, optical scanners using adversarial attacks by embedding signals into the inbound data to override alignment, to throw things out of whack, to trick a accounting system into not taking the face value of the bill, but something much higher, to give people access to buildings based on visual recognition that's poisoned. And so the adversarial robustness of the overall organization as an entity against model changes, against model attacks, and also against teammate and talent volatility is something that's absolutely not trivial. I think that, again, one of the hallmarks of a good leader in this very turbulent time is to lead by example and to say, say in a meeting, I didn't know that. Let me have a quick cloud session about this topic, or let me try to do a 10-minute YouTube tutorial in my between two meetings and then talk about that, or do a weekend seminar on generative AI. There's some very, very good classes out there. You can totally complete them in a weekend. And I think it has a huge signal effect if a board member, the CEO, et al., say like, "Oh yeah, I've written a few lines of Python. I've learned survival Python, or I've learned survival generative AI," to lead by example and say that this is something that we have to do. And because it's moving so fast, you can't commit to a 6-month training plan. You have to think about reading newsletters, trying stuff out your own, having chat sessions with OpenAI about how does attention really work in these large language models. What does attention is all you need really mean? And just splicing it in, snackable learning is just becoming so essential for everybody. And that's including the board and the C-suite, all the way down to people that are even not technical, to develop a little bit more of a gut feel of what these things can and cannot do, and learn to trust them in the right context, but not be bamboozled by their fluency. That they are just always going to sound extremely convincing, and they can be confidently wrong. One of the earliest tests that I did with GPT when it first came out, I asked it are cow eggs bigger than chicken eggs? And it very confidently went on for 2.5 pages about how big cow eggs are, and the shell is much harder, and they're not meant for human consumption, and so on and so forth. And that's fixed now, right? But there are many other hallucinations that are still in there, and that it will, give you incorrect quotes to law cases that don't exist, or URLs to studies that are made up out of whole cloth. So learning what LLMs really are, token prediction machines, and that they are not, they're seemingly intelligent and they are very smart in some ways, but it's still a lot about how you use them.
That's right. And I think that's where the application layer is so critical, right? These foundation models are getting dramatically better, really incredible, like the pace of improvement. But the application layer to serve different verticals, different teams, particularly regulated spaces where I think the bar of being usable is quite high. And unless you build that right application layer where you can trust the software, understand how confident it truly is, because it's going to sound confident almost regardless of whether it truly is correct or not. I think these are the types of things that you have to go and engineer as you build out the application on top of the software itself. I think going back to your earlier point, I'm very curious about this because the talent has been unequally divided. Fang obviously benefits quite a lot. You also have foundation model companies that benefit. Maybe in some ways, startups also benefit because the splashy startups kind of attract talent that wants to grow and learn and move quickly. What is it like for enterprise in terms of upskilling their existing talent base and then securing new talent to help them navigate AI, especially if they decide to build more internally versus doing that with external partners?
Yeah, and it's a struggle, right? The talent wars continue. The amount of money that's being paid is sometimes eye-watering. And for a, let's say, small manufacturing company in the Midwest, it's going to be very hard to compete with the big, shiny, attractive major enterprises in banking and tech and so on and so forth. So I think that your talent strategy, as I mentioned before, you have to be very nimble, reaching out through non-traditional channels, being able to sponsor competitions in or Shark Tanks in universities, for example, to get unaided awareness of a talent pool that's pretty sizable around the world, that you exist, that you do AI, and let them experiment. They're all thirsty for data and real world context. And so being able to provide that to a university department is incredibly helpful, because they can now do realistic work with real context and real feedback from senior execs. That's incredibly attractive, and maybe makes people aware that you really want to attract into your talent pool. The other thing is that upskilling needs to be aligned to incentives. So are you rewarding people fiscally for taking courses in AI, right? At the end of the day, people will do what they get paid for. And if you make that part of their key performance indicators or annual goals, and model it again through the C-suite all the way down to all the layers of implementation, and showing that, yes, the CEO took a course on generative AI too, or Python, or whatever it may be, that can have this very strong signal effect that makes it much more credible. So incentive alignment is one key thing. Knowledge capture is absolutely critical. Again, the platform becomes very important. Where does the data asset live? Where does the code asset live that your developer has made? Is it discoverable? Can other people find it and rediscover it if that person left? How well documented is it? And is it safely checked into a source code repository on somebody's laptop? Think that data science volatility and talent is 18 to 24 months. And you need to just plan for that. And that will simply happen. How do you capture what these people now know? And how do you make it usable, a liquid data asset to other people in your company, is a part of the talent strategy, must be part of the talent strategy. And upskilling, I think, look at how many offerings you have that people can consume in 15 to 35-minute increments. And that's what's really going to work. If you make available a 6-month degree or 2-year degree, the take rate is simply going to be much lower, and the usability is going to be much lower. So look at, can you craft a portfolio that people can really consume in very small increments? Can you create a custom GPT that helps people interactively have a totally tailored conversation about these topics with no fear of being shamed or not knowing things or feeling insufficient or whatever, because the machine just doesn't care? Can you make that available internally as an educational tool and now turn learning into a conversation, encourage people to say, I didn't know that, so I just asked the, whatever you call your bot.
I like that structured curriculum approach. It doesn't have to be formal, but I think there needs to be a deliberate effort by enterprise to go and introduce new resources, incentivize talent to upskill, and then create opportunity for them to apply the skill sets, right? Because one thing that could happen is that they learn a whole lot about agentic AI or generative AI, and then they just don't have adequate opportunities to apply it, right? But doing all of the above, I think will help attract new talent, upskill existing talent, and of course retain talent, because otherwise you have talent that upskills and then walks out the door, which also doesn't do you any good.
Yeah. And I think most AI practitioners, what they really want to do, I mean, they want to get paid, but what they really want to do is get stuff done. And the more you can enable that and have them show real results that maybe also be able to be made public, if you're a large company, that you reward them through senior executive time in addition to the monetary incentives, So just getting things into production is such a high goal for most. I think most technical people really treasure that more so than an extra, tens of thousands of dollars of compensation. Of course, if it's totally disproportionate, it will still be attractive. But getting things done, getting things into production is absolutely a great thing and makes, is very satisfying. And without beating the dead horse further to death, but how do you enable people to experiment inside your organization? You have to have safe data, right? Because even within a bank or within a healthcare provider organization or within almost any company, it's not that trivial to just get access to production data. It's very unsafe and for good reason, right? And it's highly governed and regulated. You need a lot of permissions and sometimes extra skills. But if you have safe data that people can really sandbox play with, then you can actually encourage that putting that thing that they learned in the course into production within a safe boundary, but in a much more practical way than just watching a video.
Yep. Let's maybe turn our attention to data silos, the data quality issues. I mean, we hear that enterprises often get stuck on that piece, right? Which is like they feel like their data house is not in order. They're worried that they can't really do generative AI. And so they're like, let's pause on doing AI altogether until we get our data in order. But at the same time, you don't have the luxury of waiting 3 to 5 years to maybe attempt to get your data in order. So where do you fit? Where do you feel enterprises should be on that? Let's wait for our data to be perfect or not perfect, but like really, really in high quality before we get started with AI versus can we get basically some unlocks of value with AI immediately while still putting the data pieces together at the organizational level?
Yeah, and the basic lens that I look at data through is data liquidity, which is a term and a concept pioneered by the CISR, the Center for Information Systems Research at MIT. Some very good writing there, very good studies if you want to look it up at MIT. And the core idea of data liquidity is that data is only an asset if it's discoverable, if it's of high quality, and it can actually be moved and can be operationalized in your organization. Otherwise, it's just a locked asset. It's like oil that's not yet been explored or not pulled out of the ground. So data liquidity is one of the core determinants of how quickly AI can become practical and throw off value, or almost any data-driven project. And that can be internal and external value. It doesn't always have to be green dollars, right? But it can be reduction in overhead, can be internal efficiencies and things like that. Better understanding of the market, of your customers, better product design. Those are all benefits that are not directly dollarizable, but come from good data liquidity. So I think that waiting for perfect data is a fool's errand. It will never happen, right? It has never happened in the recorded history of data. Probably very few companies can claim any kind of like high level of data synchronicity like that. But in a data federated organization, I think data federation is a fact of life for most large organizations. Having good discoverability, which aids liquidity, of course, is key. So having a good data marketplace, and then incrementally curing data as it's in transit is another best practice that you say, well, the data is imperfect. It's got null values where there aren't supposed to be, or it's the age distributions are off, or other data quality issues, right? Or it's too sparse of a matrix and so on and so forth. So how do you cure that in flight? How do you cure it every time it moves? And then how do you make that available in a robust way via a marketplace so that features can be consumed? Because data is one thing, right? But for AI, machine learning, and generative AI, features matter much more. And a good feature store can really hyper accelerate your overall AI game.
I know we spoke about this earlier before this recording, but maybe for this audience, what are some of the most promising use cases for generative AI that you're seeing be successful within enterprise?
So some of the core things are not super sexy, honestly, right? They're making back office processes faster, helping HR teammates to look up procedures, policies, or frontline employees help look them up. Bank teller help them look up how do you open a Boy Scout account, or how do you do something with bereavement separation, or things like that. A lot of the big use cases that we've seen in large banks, in large organizations, period, have been about operational efficiency. Large cognitive processes. I have to search for things that I might not know the exact keyword for. I need to be able to quickly compare things, summarize things. So those are where large language models are really, really excellent. And the RAG systems, properly tuned RAG systems with the right chunking and retrieval regime can be extremely helpful. Coding assistance is the other big one. Simply, it's obvious that developers that have coding assistants, co-pilots, are much more productive. It doesn't mean that they're going away, but certain tasks certainly have been automated away. And we've seen statistics from Google, 25% of all code written at Google is generated by AI. Or Salesforce came out early in the year saying we're no longer hiring any engineers this year because the automation and the co-pilots and the agents can simply do so much. So those are the real meaty enterprise use cases. I've seen very little of direct to end user bots, for example, because the vulnerability and the risks are simply too high still. Reputational risks and also adversarial risks, that people are very adept at throwing these things out of alignment and getting things out of the system that the brand, the enterprise, doesn't want them to have, or not want to have exposed publicly and then screen capped and then makes very,
Sure.
meaty headlines.
Yep, there's headline risk. That makes sense. I think it's more internal facing than for external customer facing. And it seems like the back office or maybe like assistive capabilities of generative AI are the first ones to come online, which is like bank tellers looking for information. It can be front office workers looking for more information too, but it's more assistive. What is your view on, let's say, AI that is taking actions and performing actual units of work? So this camp of agentic AI that's become super hot more recently, is that playing out? Is it still too early to tell? What's your take on that?
Yeah, I think it's a very exciting field, and it's a very promising field. We have seen some of those limitations as to how to keep those agents aligned and to avoid cascading failures. So if you have an agentic system that has 3 or 4 agents working together to solve a problem, one of them drifts out of alignment a little bit, or the foundation model underneath 1 or 2 of them suddenly performs slightly differently, and you start multiplying the failure rates. And so even if they're like 98% accurate or performance, if you multiply anything by 0.98 a few times, you'll get a pretty small number. How do you ensure that these things, when they work together in larger teams, stay aligned, stay collaborative, and that there are very few single points of failure, and that you also have ways to mathematically test when things go out of bounds? That's the other kind of the mathematical piece of generative AI. Is stochastic. It's not deterministic. It's not if then, but there are deterministic ways to guardrail these stochastic systems and to simply note when things are not performing up to a certain threshold that's predefined. It's a predefined KPI. While you cannot test an LLM conclusively in every use case, you certainly have an obligation to test it for your use case and to then have guardrails in place that are provable, that are measurable, that are KPI driven, that stop the system when it drifts out of bounds.
I think that's right. I think agentic AI is a more powerful in some ways capability, but it requires a lot more care in terms of how you set it up and then how you use it, because you could have cascading errors, right? And I think initially agentic AI is going to be closely supervised and monitored by people until you feel that's safe enough to operate. In some ways, it's like autonomous driving, right? The vehicle could largely drive itself, but you want the hands of a human driver on the steering wheel just in case, because you don't want that failure rate. So that makes a whole lot of sense, and I appreciate that view. It'll be very interesting to see sort of how this plays out over the
Yeah,
next year or two.
it's moving
And
very quickly as the rest of it is.
yeah, that's right. Bjorn, this has been an incredible conversation. Really appreciate your views. I think there's so much that our audience could benefit from learning from you. Would love to have you on in a future episode, and we could talk a little bit more about how to measure success, what metrics companies should be using, how to do AI in a way that's compliant, like ethically, but then with new regulation coming online, how to kind of go and adapt to it. But I think this is a very good starting point for a conversation that we're really excited to continue with you in the months ahead.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It's been great.